This video is sponsored by Squarespace. You can make your very own website or online store with this all-in-one platform. Hi everyone, this video is going to be a process video for my whale shark painting. It's my most recent painting. It was the print for January Patreon, and I kind of like doing these little videos where I talk about my most recent painting and what I was thinking about when I made it, what I struggled with, what I learned, and just kind of dedicating a video to talking about these specific paintings that I do every month. And someone actually asked if I was going to make one for this, and I was like, okay, yeah, sure. I mean, I was already working on it when they commented that, but it's cool to see people want to see this. So the materials I'm using are my iPad Pro. It's a 12.9-inch 3rd generation. I've had it for a few years, and I'm using Procreate and my own brushes. I actually made my own brush pack a few weeks ago, and it was a lot of fun. And I've sort of been tweaking it since then and using my brushes in the paintings I've been making just to make sure that they perform the way I want, and figuring out which ones I actually want to include in the set, because I have lots of different brushes and not all of them are good. Some of them are kind of weird. I'm sort of curating them, and I kind of went crazy for a bit and made a whole bunch of different ones, and now I'm just slowly narrowing them down as I go. I knew for January I wanted to draw whale sharks, so what I did was I just started off by sketching a bunch of them. I think the first thing I did was I drew a whole bunch in my sketchbook, and I just posted a video about that. And then after I got familiar with them, I went to my iPad and started doing thumbnails, because I wasn't really sure what composition I wanted. There's so many different angles you can do for underwater things. You can do above, below, because they're suspended in the water. There's a lot of different ways you can show that, and I was trying to decide what to do, and I couldn't make up my mind for a long time until I decided to just do sort of a simple one where you can see the side of the whale shark. You can also see its wide mouth, which is one of the things that it's actually known for. And I also wanted to make sure that I drew a bunch of those little fish that sort of hitchhike with it. There's the remoras, which are the little guys that sort of I think they actually suction cup themselves to large fish, or they kind of swim around them and eat scraps and stuff like that. And there's also the golden trevallies that swim near them. I think they ride their current or something. I think it's really cool how these fish have a sort of symbiotic relationship, and I wanted to make sure they were part of the painting as well. And I just wanted to go for a nice, simple ocean scene. I wanted to draw the ripples at the top. I wanted to have it on an angle to add sort of movement to the piece, to make it a little more dynamic. And once I did the thumbnails, I colored them in, and then I enlarged my favorite thumbnail to the full size of the piece. And at first I was going to do line art and then color it in, but I think that would have stiffened it up a lot. That would have made it a little bit static looking, I think, for this kind of scene. Because it's underwater, I wanted it to be very fluid. So I made sure to just paint over it instead of doing line art. Sometimes I do line art for painting, sometimes I don't. It really depends on the vibe of the piece and how much detail I want to do, if I want it to be more of a painterly approach, or if I want it to be line art that I color in. This one, I knew I wanted it to be more painterly, so I basically just painted on top of my thumbnail. And this can take a really long time. It can involve a lot of trial and error, but I basically just treat it the same way as an in-person painting, or I mean a traditional painting. That's a weird way to say that. Where you don't have layers, you just have your painting and you just paint over it. That's sort of how I was doing things. I also made layers on top. Every time I'm doing a digital painting, I'll make a new layer for each major change that I do, just to make sure I can go back and reverse it if it's not what I wanted. And when I wanted to make a lot of big changes, I just duplicated my canvas, and then I can make the changes, and then I can compare the two pieces, because some of the changes require me to flatten the image, move stuff around, and repaint areas. So I had to do that, I think, twice. So there was a lot of trial and error with this. And one of the biggest things that was not really turning out were the yellow fish, and they felt kind of out of place. They didn't really go with the painting. There was just something off about them until I realized they needed to be, I got advice about this, that it would look better if they sort of followed the whale's angle. And I didn't even realize that they weren't, because they're all kind of flat and like facing you, and the whale shark is sort of pointing upwards and you can see the underside of it. So near the end of this painting, you'll actually see me change a lot of the yellow fish and sort of like show their bellies and make them angle and sort of bend with the whale shark. I was trying to do that anyway with the sort of like curve that the shark is like swimming in. The whale shark, not shark. It's sort of like an upwards curve. So I was making the fish follow that curve, but their actual bodies were not being angled properly. So it looked like they were pasted on top and they weren't part of the piece. So I think the changes I made near the end to sort of like show the bottom angle of them and sort of gradually make them like face the same way as the whale shark, I think that was like a huge improvement. Now for a break to thank this video's sponsor, which is Squarespace. They're a great online platform where you can build your own customized websites. You don't need to know how to code. They have pre-built templates that you can choose from and then modify to your liking. That's how I built my website. And the way I use my website is for my portfolio mainly. And then it's also sort of a landing page where people can find me on all sorts of different social media platforms, like my Instagram, my YouTube, my TikTok, my shop, and Pinterest. Something that I've been meaning to do more with is their Fluid Engine editor. They didn't always used to have this, but now they do, which means you can drag elements around on your site and they all snap to a grid. So you have the freedom to move stuff wherever you want them to be, but they're all sort of lined up with each other in a pleasing way, so it just makes it easier to customize stuff. If this sounds interesting to you, go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch your website, go to squarespace.com/JelArts, and you can get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. Another thing that I was not sure about was the sort of like, not ripples, the beams of light you can see in the water that sort of follow a perspective, and it's sort of like beams of light shining through the water. And it took me a while to clean them up. Eventually I go in and like paint over each one, smooth them out, make sure that they're not too patchy, but they still have some texture. It was sort of a push and pull. And I even broke out a perspective grid because they sort of follow a 1-point perspective. And I made sure they all aligned with it, and that made it look a lot better because as I was cleaning it up, I realized a lot of them were sort of off and they didn't follow the proper perspective. So yeah, perspective still comes into play even when there's not buildings, there's not like structures with like hard edges. Perspective really comes into play with organic shapes as well. So I definitely noticed that with this, and it was good to have the perspective grid that Procreate can let you add on there. And also, when I was first trying to paint the ripples above the whale, I was looking at so many reference photos and I was like, okay, how am I going to make this look right? Because water can be so tricky because there's so many like subtle things you can do that make it actually read like water. And sometimes it just doesn't read like water and it doesn't look right. I think it looks okay in the end, but I figured out this one brush that I made was perfect for blending all this like water texture together. I'll include it in my brush pack once it becomes available. But I realized like, oh, this is a really nice brush for painting stuff like this because it doesn't have a full opacity, but it still has texture and it still has like a hard edge, but not too hard. And it's just a really nice blending brush. And I don't find myself using blending brushes all that often, but when I do a painting like this, instead of like a illustration with like line art and more like hard shadows, more like cell shaded looking things, not that I do cell shading, but if I do more like harsh edges, line art, textured lines, stuff like that, I don't need a brush that can blend. But this brush I needed for this illustration because I needed something that would allow me to pull everything together and to blend stuff together as I paint, but still leave a nice brushy texture. So that watercolor brush I made, I really like it. I'll be sharing it in the pack for sure. The textures that I put on it, I scanned myself. And I just really like the way they turned out. So you might see all the yellowfish disappearing. Basically what I did was I duplicated the entire painting and I made one where I masked away all the yellowfish. And then that meant the one I put above it, I could move the yellowfish around and there wouldn't be like white gaps or like second yellowfish appearing beneath them. I could move them around and like the leftover space that they left behind after moving them would show just like a normal background behind them. I don't know if that made any sense, what I just explained. But basically I had a layer underneath that would make it easier to like move the fish and not have to do as much repainting because sometimes when you have to move elements around, you get these like white gaps that you have to fill in before you can see if your changes actually worked or not. But this is the time where I was doing some trial and error with the fish, trying to make them face the shark a little more, like follow the same angle as the whale shark. And I was like, okay, this is actually starting to come together, starting to work. This is definitely what it was missing. It was also a lot of fun to paint the rocks. I like painting things that have low contrast. There's just something kind of satisfying about it. I think when I first started art, I didn't really know how to do this sort of technique where like if something is not the focus, it can still have detail, but it just doesn't have a lot of contrast. Like the rocks are mostly like dark grays. Well, not gray, but they're mostly like dark shadows and dark midtones. And the brighter midtones and the highlights are around the whale shark and where it actually matters. And it was just fun to do like very subtle hue shifts within the rocks, some greens, some blues here and there, some darker shadows, and then the highlights aren't even that bright. They're just lighter than the darks. So you can really play around with like the low contrast parts of the painting like that. And last but not least, I wanted to add a bunch of little bubbles, a bunch of little like atmospheric effects that are best added at the end so that you don't have to keep them in mind when you're like actually like painting and rendering the whole piece. So I added like little bubbles here and there. I added beams of light that come from like different areas of the water above. And I think adding these small little details really just make it feel more finished. I honestly wish I added some more highlights on the yellow fish. I feel like they get a little bit lost or they don't like jump out enough. Like I think there might need to be some more highlights in some areas, but it's kind of too late for that. I'm not really sure what I think because I've been staring at this for so long, but I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out and how it all came together in the end, because at a certain point I was like, this is not turning out. I don't know what's going wrong. Something's really off about this, but I think it's at a place that I am very happy with. Like, of course, there's always some things I might want to change, but where it stands, I'm pretty happy. So the window for getting this on Patreon has ended, but it will be on my shop eventually, whatever I have left over, and the stickers and the other things. Patreon is just a way to get things earlier and at a better deal, and you don't have to pay shipping on Patreon as well, and you get all the digital rewards. But February will be a new painting. I just wanted to talk about this one and show you the process. Let me know if you've ever drawn a whale shark, and if you like drawing them. I find their spots really challenging to like place them. It took me a while to figure that out, and I talked more about this in my like whale shark sketchbook session that I did like last week, a few weeks ago. But thanks so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed seeing me draw this whale shark and hear my thoughts. It's always fun to discuss an entire painting like this, and I will see you in my next video.